Every day, we rise, challenging ourselves to work for what we believe in. At U.S. Border Patrol, protecting our borders is more than a job. It's a calling. Agents answer the call, working together to keep our country and communities safe. If you are ready for a new mission, join U.S. Border Patrol and go beyond. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
These days, work is in trouble. We've outsourced most of our manufacturing to other countries. And with that, we sent away good jobs and our capability to make things. American Giant is a clothing company that's pushing back against this tide. They make all kinds of high-quality clothing and activewear, like sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more, right here in the USA. So when you buy American Giant, you create jobs in towns and cities across the country. And jobs bring pride, purpose. They stitch people together. If all that sounds good to you, visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com with promo code STAPLE20.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. She's one of our favorites. We take a break from the politics of the day, talk a little history, usually some kind of presidential history. We just did about 4 or 5 of the First Lady ones. If you missed any of those, make sure you go back and watch them. She also wrote about it at electionsdaily.com, our good friends over there. We got another one. We're doing presidents and presidential health. Sarah Stook, great to see you again, my friend. How are you?
Great to be back.
I love having you. Okay, so everybody talks about President Biden's health. Talked about it a little bit with Trump a couple different times. Talking about presidential health is not a new thing. And not only is it not a new thing, it's actually a pertinent thing because we've had quite a few presidents actually die in office, haven't we?
8, which is, pretty alarming for, natural causes, one might say, then for who sort of at the end of the assassin's bullet, and more who probably nearly died. Reagan was shot, Jackson was tried. There was presidents get poorly, but unfortunately there has been 8 who have died while in office.
It's funny in the American system because you're in the UK. It's very you're just used to your leaders resigning or getting out of office some other way. We've had only one resignation, although we've had a couple that gotten close. We only had one resign, but we've had 8 die in office. That's kind of unusual in the grand scheme of things, isn't it?
Well, obviously we're not an absolute monarchy anymore, but in monarchies, you expect them to die because that's kind of the point. And then they will go on to their son, daughter, whoever. But you kind of expect that in leaders. They, a lot of these, they're older blokes. They're, some of their health isn't too great. Living in times where modern medicine wasn't around, anyone could die of anything.
Let's go through these because these are just fascinating, and I love doing these kind of histories. The first one to die in history was William Henry Harrison. Now, he was 68, so in 1841, that's actually pretty old. Modern technology, people tend to live a little longer now. 68 was a pretty good run back then. He died, we're not exactly sure, pneumonia, typhoid, something, but give a little background, though, who William Henry Harrison was, kind of one of the more probably unknown presidents to the modern here.
Well, to quote Simpsons, when they did the President's Day, he lived for 30 days, if we're going to be technical, it was 31. He was a war hero who had made himself to be a hard-drinking cider-man log cabin bloke, even though he was from quite good stock, who famously did a very, very long inaugural address in March, in snow and rain in Washington, which is a big no-no. But there is the myth that I think most people believe that he died because of that. Not technically true. He did get pneumonia later, as he used to like walking around Washington meeting people without a coat. And yeah, it's a swamp. It's 1841 and it's a swamp. So he developed what is either believed to be pneumonia or typhoid. And after a month in office, he died. And everyone was like, oh, bum, we didn't know what to do. because it was the first time it happened. There was no real precedent. So everyone was like, is John Tyler president? Is the acting president? What is going on?
Yeah, and it's interesting. You made a mention on this is the swamp killed him, and that's not like what President Trump always talked about, the swamp or the DC is literally built on a swamp. It's a tidal basin. It's a swamp, and this kind of weather. And you mentioned it. This almost killed George Washington back in 1799.
Yeah, I mean, you can obviously presidents get poorly, but back at when Washington was around and Adams and all those. Well, yeah, because you got yellow fever, you got malaria, you got all sorts of things, or outbreaks and epidemics. Especially in, obviously Washington didn't reside in Washington, but later presidents, you're always going to run that risk.
Also interesting, and I found this kind of morbidly funny. You mentioned that there might have been a real simple thing that also made his health bad, that in 1844, the White House's water supply was diluted. This is not uncommon in that era. Sewage and bacteria, they didn't have clean drinking water. Pretty amazing that something as simple as clean drinking water probably attributed to the ill health of a president. But that was the case for thousands and if not millions of people of that era also.
It kills millions every year. There's always adverts in the UK about, water aid, getting clean and safe water. There are typhoid epidemics. Unfortunately, clean water is so important, but, sadly it is still a problem, but we associate it in the Western world with Harrison and that generation.
All right. In your piece, electionsdaily.com, we linked to it. You always go, could they have survived today? Pneumonia is very serious. In fact, pneumonia is a very big killer because usually somebody that's sick of something else, they die of pneumonia because they get it in the hospital. A lot of cancer patients die of pneumonia.
Ronald Reagan, Freddie Mercury.
Yeah, pneumonia is what kills you when you're sick with something else. But it is treatable now. Again, we mentioned 68's pretty old back then. Modern day era, does he survive, you think?
He didn't really seem to have anything else too badly wrong with him. He survived war, so pretty tough customer. Antibiotics, bed rest, typhoid, you could have a vaccine. He would survive. Might feel a bit rough, but he'd be all right.
Yeah. So he was the first, and everybody kind of panicked, didn't know what to do. But Zachary Taylor did the same thing 9 years later. Taylor's such an interesting character in history. He's another one of those that's kind of got those period before the Civil War presidents just don't get the press that the other ones seem to do. But he was a very interesting character in history. Talk for just a second about who Zachary Taylor was leading up to his presidency before we get to what actually killed him.
He was another war hero and very well regarded. He was replaced by a guy called Millard Fillmore. So, that's this fascinating war hero and succeeded by a guy with a very strange name that somehow everybody forgets. He was at a 4th of July celebration. He had some cherry with raw milk with raw rice. And he died of gastroenteritis, something along those lines, because that water, that milk, that ice was not very clean.
Now, this actually sparked a big conspiracy theory at the time because it seemed so out of the blue, because he was 65, but again, war hero, was seen as pretty healthy and virulent at the time. There was a conspiracy that maybe there was an assassination here, that it was arsenic, that it was some kind of poisoning, because it did seem so out of the blue and because he did seem to suffer of a stomach thing for, I think, 5 or 6 days he lingered before he finally died of it.
And plus, there was rumors that, the Confederates, the later Confederates, the South versus the North, they weren't happy with him. And they did, dig up his body years later and said there was a bit of more than normal, but no indication that it would have killed him.
So was it a conspiracy, or did he just eat too much fruit and milk?
Fruit and milk, sadly, I think, with very unclean water, sort of went of the way of Henry Harrison.
So something like gastroenteritis, perhaps cholera, which was very common at the time. Taylor, he gets it today. Does he survive, you think?
I mean, gastroenteritis is not very fun, but, with proper rest, proper treatment, you can be better. Cholera still exists, however, there are medications for it. And, he wouldn't have maybe even got it today because his water would have been clean.
Every day, we rise, challenging ourselves to work for what we believe in. At U.S. Border Patrol, protecting our borders is more than a job. It's a calling. Agents answer the call, working together to keep our country and communities safe. If you're ready for a new mission, join U.S. Border Patrol and go beyond. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
True enough. All right, here's one everybody probably thinks they know, but there's probably some ins and outs of it that folks probably aren't aware of. Abraham Lincoln, survival is not part of this, although he lived for, 12 hours after he got shot through the head, which is pretty remarkable. Lincoln, of course, was assassinated. We know John Wilkes Booth. We know it was a close-range gunshot to the back of the head. But what's some of the other parts of this assassination that people don't really think of when they hear about Lincoln's assassination? He was 57 years old. In his youth, he was extremely athletic. He was known to be a very good wrestler, very wiry kind of guy. So his health good while he was in office? He wrote himself about the extreme strain of the Civil War. We see the before and after pictures of just 4 years in office. Before the assassination, how was Lincoln's health, you think?
His health wasn't, amazing. It wasn't, as bad as some presidents like Kennedy, but, he suffered many ailments of the day. It's believed that he suffered from depression. His wife was also very mentally unwell, so that was an added stress. He lost his children. There's believed he's had some kind of conditions. However, these are ones that you can't really diagnose all these years later. He was shot point blank, which in the films, if someone gets shot in the head, they usually just die. But it's not usually like that in real life. It's not just it's loud, it's messy. It's not just a little bullet hole. Back of the head, what it did to him. He lived for about 9 hours. When they took him across to the boarding house, the doctor said, there's nothing we can do. It was a case of keeping him comfortable. Even today, it's very unlikely. There are some people, some surgeons who have been interviewed who said he could have lived, but he would have had extremely severe deficits, motor function, speaking, thinking. And, back then the treatment of disabled people wasn't fantastic and he could have died from anything else. But I don't believe he would have survived. Point blank to the back of the head. You're not surviving that.
And for the forensic nuts that watch all those shows on TV, the Derringer that he's using in one of the reasons the Civil War was so brutal, these aren't bullets like we have today. These guys are just shooting chunks of metal at each other that are soft lead, and they basically deform as soon as they hit anything. This isn't like a quick, clean bullet wound like you see today. This is just a big chunk of metal at a low muzzle velocity going right at the back of somebody's head. So that's also it's why he lived as long as he did, but it's also why it's so destructive for the medicine of the time. These kind of wounds were just brutal.
Oh, completely. He, even today, like I said, there are some people who get shot in the head and survive. It's, they're very lucky, but like I said, it's not like in the films. And as you said, it'd be very destructive. And, it would have killed probably even a healthier man. If it could be a young 20-something man. Sadly, it's one of those things that doesn't really discriminate by age or health.
Yeah, and historically, just put a little perspective on it, because we've had 2 presidents die in office before this. You got to think of the time period. The Civil War was extremely traumatic to the nation. This was really something that just struck everybody to the absolute core when Lincoln got shot, wasn't it?
It's the first time the president was assassinated in office. So, it's not just a death, it's an assassination. As you said, under extremely traumatic and bloody war. He led the nation through it. So you couldn't really imagine anybody else, sort of like Roosevelt with World War II, taking over. And if you said to somebody, famous assassinations, even the UK people might say Lincoln.
Really? Why is that? Just because it's such a strong, because you've had some stuff in UK history as well. It's interesting they would say Lincoln.
Well, we've only had one prime minister assassinated, and that was Spencer Perceval back in the early 19th century. But when you think of assassinations, you might think attempted assassinations. You might think of Margaret Thatcher, maybe in the UK, maybe Lord Mountbatten, IRA, sort of that kind of one. But if you said to me assassinations, my mind would immediately go to maybe like Martin Luther King.
Right. And
kind
you've
of did the
talked
same
before
thing.
that Kennedy was kind of a worldwide thing for a lot of folks as well. Fascinating stuff. One more of this earlier era, and then we're going to get into the more of a modern era of presidents. But James A. Garfield, I find this case so fascinating because I've actually read quite a bit of the medical stuff. I've watched some shows on this. This is one of those, if they'd left him alone, he probably might have lived. But we'll get into that in just a second. Start with James A. Garfield, who he was, a little bit about his presidency, and what led up to this assassination.
He was quite young. I think he was only about 49, 50 when he died. So one of our younger presidents. He was a Republican who had served under Rutherford B. Hayes and also McKinley, a few of the Civil War presidents. He was coming out of a train station, along with Lincoln's son, who had an unfortunate timing of being around or near 3 of the 4 presidential assassinations that he was alive for. So he was shot by Charles Guiteau, who was a mentally ill man who believed he was, somehow related to Richard III of England. As Garfield, he'd pledged to end the act of patronage where people would basically support you and then you'd get a job. He was against that. And he tried to get hold of Garfield because back then you could basically walk into the White House. It's a little bit concerning. And Garfield said no, and so unfortunately he was shot, and he lingered for quite a while, quite a few months. Like you said, the bullet wound, I mean, obviously no bullet wound is particularly a good thing, but if it'd been left alone or actually done surgically properly, he would have been fine. He was young, fairly healthy. There's no reason to think he wouldn't survive, even in that day and age. But they hadn't actually worked out about bacteria yet, and that you're supposed to wash your hands. So they thought, we're doctors. It was considered extremely offensive to say that doctors were unclean. The person who discovered germ theory was actually locked in an asylum for daring to suggest that the hands of doctors were unclean. So they were prodding around, poking everything, while he was in probably absolute agony. And at first it thought it would survive, and then it sort of went a bit downhill from there. And
there was a comedy of errors here. Alexander Graham Bell showed up with a prototype of a metal detector, but he was laying on a metal spring bed, so that didn't work. Most of the doctor documentation is they were actually on the wrong side of the body looking for the bullet because they didn't understand ballistics at the time, so they didn't understand it had stopped on the other side, and they were looking in the wrong place. They prodded him with bare hands, as you tell. He lived for this went for 3 months.
I can't imagine.
Yeah, he went for 3 months. They moved him back to New Jersey, trying to heal him that way. This was a god-awful mess medically, but politically this was a mess too, because Chester Arthur was the vice president. The assassin had stated he wanted Arthur to be president, so obviously he was trying to do a low-profile thing. He didn't really want to take over the reins. This was a mess on a lot of levels, wasn't it?
I mean, people accuse Arthur of being behind the assassination, and is not the last president to be accused of being behind it, as we will see with Johnson a little later on. So, I think vice presidents want to be president, but unfortunately it only usually happens when the president's heartbeat stops.
Yeah, I've always found it fascinating. The picture is infamous, but I would have loved for there to have been some decent high-quality video of Johnson swearing in on the plane, because you can just see it on his face, like he does not want to be there. Like you can just see it, and Jackie's there, and it had to be just, hellish to go through that. And they took a still picture, and that's probably why there is no video and film of it, because they probably was like, not filming this. But I think it would have been fascinating to see. Okay, that's kind of the older area. We're going to get into the modern era. More presidential death, assassination, and otherwise. Unfortunately, in modern era, that's pretty much the only way it happens. We're going to talk a little bit more about presidential health. Our historian friend, Sarah Stook from over in the UK, electionsdaily.com and the Mallard. We love having her. More with her right after this on Heard Tell. Welcome back to Heard Tell. We're talking to our friend Sarah Stook over in the UK, our historian friend. We're talking about presidents, presidential health, more specifically those who health failed either by illness or an assassin's bullet. This is the latter. William McKinley, 1901. He's 58 years old. He goes to this exhibition up in Buffalo. Again, it's amazing. The story isn't more well known than it is. He walks into the exhibition hall and he is, to kind of simplify it, gets gut shot by this guy, this radical, crazy man. Doesn't kill him directly. In fact, one of the most amazing scenes in presidential history. He's laying there bleeding and gut shot. The mob starts to beat this dude to death, and McKinley raises his voice and tells them to stop, and they stop, which is just amazing. But talk about William McKinley, his assassination, and this is really a pivotal moment in American history, not just because the poor president got assassinated, but because of who his vice president was and who his vice president became.
Well, he was just started his second term. His original vice president had been Garrett Hobart, who had sadly died of a heart attack. So Theodore Roosevelt became vice president because he'd become far too troublesome as governor of New York, and the Republican Party wanted him in a dead-end position. It was Mark Hanna who said, "If that damn cowboy will be president if anything happens to Garfield," which, McKinley, which sadly came true. So McKinley was at the Buffalo World Expedition. I can't say it. Exhibition, and he was shaking hands. Now, usually you would have to have both of your hands showing, but because it was a hot day, people had handkerchiefs. So the Secret Service said, "Yeah, that's fine." They said to him, "Don't go and shake hands." But McKinley was a very social man who could shake, 50 hands in like a minute. He was very good, and he was of the belief that nobody would want to harm the president. So before he got to his assassin, he shook the hand of a little girl and he gave her his lucky pin, which is a little ironic because the next person who shot his hand shot him in the stomach.
Yeah, it was a mess. But here's another one. Initially, they thought he would live. He seemed to be doing decently well. In fact, Roosevelt had rushed back he was vacationing up at Saginaw. He rushed back, and then he even went back on vacation. They thought the president was going to live. Unbeknownst to them, he actually had a cardiac issue that nobody knew about. He actually died of probably pancreatitis when they looked into this. Here's another one where he kind of lingered for a while, and it was kind of surprising when he died because they thought he might actually live from this.
Yeah, I mean, actually, funnily enough, X-ray machine was being exhibited at the exhibition, and they thought, no, it's not. It's too early to use it, which is kind of understandable. But hindsight is a wonderful thing. Yeah, Roosevelt was told that he would be all right. He said, "Okay, cool, I'm going to go back on holiday," which is you'd think they would say, just stay just in case. But this was even before the vice president had, a little more power than they did. So you think, yes, it was a little worrying he went off. He seemed okay, McKinley, but it turns out he had gangrene, which is, ugh. And sadly, he died in a fair amount of pain.
Yeah, and one of the real sad, his last words were actually about his wife. One of the sad scenes of this was his wife, I guess, completely lost it right towards the end as the end was near and it was obvious. She had a total breakdown, and that kind of finished him off, poor guy. Here's another one, though, survival, modern medicine with the underlying cardiac issue. I don't know if it would be easy to say, yeah, surgery could have saved him, but with the other issues he had, surgery is a complicated thing. That's traumatic on the body. I know this one firsthand. Would he have been saved modernly? I think this one's kind of up in the air.
He was shot in the stomach, which, as far as getting shot is concerned, is probably the worst place because, it can bounce around and, it's not very nice. His cardiac issue probably could have been, foreseen. It would have been diagnosed. I think, Garfield was pretty much a certainty he could have lived today. McKinley, so-so. I think with good treatment, with good outcome, sure. But, people can die of getting their appendix out and getting the tonsils out. Like, surgery always carries that risk, no matter how good the surgeon and how, clean and sterile the environment is.
All right, here's somebody we talked about when we did the First Ladies to some extent because his other proclivities outside of politics. We'll leave it at that. Warren G. Harding, interesting character, died apparently of a heart attack. He sat straight up in bed and started convulsing and basically keeled over dead. Talk about Warren Harding and him dying in office. Again, here's a guy who was probably in poor health in general. He was 57. Again, like we talked about on the First Ladies episode, kind of an interesting character anyway. Talk about him for a minute.
Harding was in his first term. He was extremely popular because Teapot Dome and a lot of the other scandals had not come out yet. That would severely ruin his reputation. He was very gregarious. He was very open, especially compared to Wilson, who was a bit of a cold fish. There was a trip with the presidential posse down the west coast of America, starting at Alaska. Harding didn't initially want to go, but Florence said, "I'm seeing Alaska, and that's that." So went to Alaska. He got a bit of food poisoning, but was okay. Then moved on to Oregon, which was when he started to feel poorly. So they cancelled that trip and went to San Francisco. He was still fairly poorly. They diagnosed some kind of heart condition, perhaps a stomach condition. He said he was okay walking to the hotel, but he sadly collapsed and had to be helped back up. They prescribed him with medicine that probably helped trigger his heart attack because they didn't know what heart attack was at the time. His wife Florence was reading some praise in the news. His last words were, "That's good, read on." And like you said, suddenly clutched his heart, convulsed, went dead. And by the time Florence was back, well, he was dead basically by the time he hit the bed.
Yeah. What effect did this have in history? Because again, Harding's kind of one of those forgotten presidents because of the people that came before and directly after him. He died in 1923. Just big picture wise, how did the country take this news?
Well, he was very popular at the time because, like I said, didn't know about the scandals. The industry was booming, the economy was enjoying rapid success. Sort of one of those things. What would have happened? He probably would have won re-election, but Calvin Coolidge took over, a popular president, especially among Republicans, even to this day. But it's quite a shock because he's this popular guy with a popular wife, and suddenly, he just has a heart attack.
All right. A towering figure in American history, the longest-serving president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. We know his health was bad. It was hidden from the public at the time. Of course, we know he couldn't stand unassisted, these sorts of things. Died at age 63, 1945. The cause of death was listed as a cerebral hemorrhage. This had to just be brutal to a nation who had just kind of come to rely on FDR, whatever you thought of his politics and all that stuff. He'd been president for half a generation at this point.
He'd been president for 12 years. Many people couldn't remember a time before him.
Yeah, really. And, World War II is winding down. People are starting to see the end of the light at the end of the tunnel of World War II. They're starting to be hopeful that the war is going to come to an end. And then this hits the country just culturally and politically, though. This was really a bomb to America that was otherwise distracted by World War II, right?
I can't say I was alive for it, but
you're a historian, so
yeah, I can't use the before my time excuse that many years. He was in very poor health, and it's believed he had either polio or a similar disease, Guillain-Barré disease, which is sort of similar, but historians aren't sure which one it was. He was in poor health generally. He had heart issues, blood pressure, tension. When he came back from Yalta, everybody was shocked. Even at Yalta, Churchill and Stalin were like, "Whoa, this dude is poorly." And
you can tell in the pictures, like he's leaning over in the chairs. He's not sitting up.
He's so
just
gaunt.
The picture. Yeah, you can tell in the pictures of the Yalta conference. I think Stalin had actually wrote in some of his personal writings about how bad FDR looked at Yalta, among other things. So it was kind of probably more well known outside of America than inside of America, just how poorly he was, wasn't it?
Because back then you could hide. The Secret Service would take the cameras of photographers who'd seen him in his wheelchair. They would have it destroyed or bribe them otherwise. So, it's not like today where every move is, taken. We all know about Joe Biden having COVID, for example. So it kept quiet. But he was always quite a poorly man. He was never healthy. Paralysis aside, he had so many issues. It's sort of a bit of a wonder how he wasn't killed earlier. It's maybe sheer willpower got him through because, he just started a fourth term, which we're never going to see again because of constitutional amendments.
Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played. To be fair to FDR, though, we know what the Civil War did to Lincoln. Wilson wrote about the strain of World War I, even though that was only really about a 2-year, 18-month period, and he was incapacitated for part of that, but that's another story for another day. We know what JFK and Johnson and Nixon wrote about Vietnam. We know what W has talked about, the war on terror. Obama has talked about it. Wartime presidents, and that war in specifically, where it was all-encompassing because you had the entire country on a war footing. You had, the biggest conflict the world has ever seen, hopefully ever will see. It had to have taken a toll. It just had. There's no way that doesn't grind a man up. I don't care what kind of man it is, right?
He'd been president. I mean, the war had been going on for just about 4 years in America, obviously a bit longer because you guys were pretty late to the game.
Easy now. We got there eventually.
Yeah, it took you a while there, didn't it? You're seeing, your land's attacked, millions of young boys and men being shipped off to he did put the Japanese American in internment camps. Whether he actually felt sorry for that or not is a different matter. It's not easy being a president, even in peacetime, I'd argue. Wartime is just in the kettle of fish entirely, which is why I firmly believe if a president, prime minister, or leader puts themselves, in glory in wartime, that is why they're remembered. And I think foreign policy can make or break a president. And, his obviously foreign policy is still extremely domestic, is really well guarded today, and he is constantly seen as one of, if not the best president. But yeah, it was long and tiring. Still managed to find time for affairs, though.
Yeah, a great movie about the Hudson. Bill Murray plays FDR. You ought to go watch that movie at some point. Okay, here's the one that looms large anytime you do a list of presidents dying in office. I guess generationally, this might be easing off just a little bit because time passes. But the assassination of JFK, we've talked about it before with you as we've talked about presidents over the years. Where does this sit in the consciousness today? Because again, that generation where, everybody knew where they were when JFK died, they're getting older now. It's more of a historical thing now than a lived experience. Does it still loom as large as it did? And where is it in kind of the collective consciousness, the assassination of JFK?
I don't think my generation has had its you remember where you were moment yet. The 1963 assassination was something my nana can remember and said everyone was very shocked and upset because he was young and handsome and popular. For my mum, it was Princess Diana dying and 9/11. I was alive for 9/11, but I was pretty young, so I have absolutely no memory of it. But yeah, that was the remember where you were moment. And, it was so sudden. It wasn't like he was known to be poorly. He was probably one of the sickest presidents we've ever seen, but this was hidden, of course, because you could back then, and Joe Kennedy spent a lot of money trying to hide it. So he's going along in, people don't realize how unsafe Dallas was for him. This was, just the civil rights movement was really gaining speed when, race relations were so poor. Dallas was dangerous. He was told in no uncertain times, you should probably not go. There were threats. The Secret Service was processing hundreds, if not thousands, of threats, handbills calling Kennedy a traitor. But he had to because he needed Texas for 64. So off he went with Jackie. And, usually Jackie didn't go, but they'd lost their son Patrick very shortly before. And she said, okay, I'll come. And she was extremely popular. So she was sort of a great campaign asset. He went with, Governor Connolly, Nellie Connolly, the Johnsons, driving along, and suddenly, boom, 3 shots, 2 hit him, one sort of in the neck area and one in the head. He's straightened up by his back brace, so that hits him. Blood, skull, bone fragments all over the car. Clint Hill jumps on the top, they rush to Parkland. He was certainly wouldn't survive. This isn't a case of Garfield or McKinley when it was definitely either. Even Roosevelt, cerebral hemorrhages are really, really bad at the best of times. And, he couldn't a man of his health and age, even today, probably wouldn't survive. But with Kennedy, people could say he survived, but the man had half his skull out. When they got to Parkland, they looked at him and said, "No." I mean, they tried. They had to do something, thoracotomy, heart massage, but he was missing half his brain, half his skull. He never regained consciousness. He was kind of there, but not there. Last rites, did his last rites like 5-6 times in his life. So his was a very horrific death. Hopefully for him it was instantaneous, but for Jackie and the Connollys, because we forget Governor Connolly was shot as well. Luckily he survived.
And the thing about Kennedy that they didn't know then, because the press is different, we do know now, Kennedy may not have lived out his term anyway, because his health was so bad. They had him on all kinds of drugs to keep him going. The reason that when you look at the video of the assassination, he falls so funny, like you mentioned, he had to wear a very heavy back brace to kind of keep him upright because his back was so shot. He was taking massive amounts of drugs, both for his condition and also for pain management. Kennedy was in horrible shape health-wise. We believe he had Addison's disease, which is an autoimmune disease. He may not have lived his term out anyway, which is one of those great what ifs with Kennedy. Everybody talks about, well, what if he didn't get shot? It's like, well, if he didn't get shot, his health was so bad, it's hard to tell what would have happened with the poor guy.
Even if the bullet had hit a sort of a less dangerous place, he probably wouldn't have made surgery. He wouldn't have got out of the theatre alive. There's a very good chance of that. Like you said, it is a miracle. Like, if you read his health history, it's unbelievable how that man lived his age. Today it might have been a bit better with modern medicine, but he still had a lot of diseases. Addison's disease is a lot better now, but still, autoimmune disorders never particularly a good thing.
No, it's not. Okay. To bring all this into we have a president who's pushing 80, will be over 80 when he runs for re-election. If he chooses to do so, his primary opponent, President Trump, ain't exactly young either. We have the top 4 or 5 people in the line of presidential succession are either close to or over 80. Speaker Pelosi and Grassley. We are going to have more and more geriatric politicians. We have a bunch of them now. What is fair and what is not fair to talk about age and health when it comes to a president or a senator or even a congressman, do you think?
I think, when it's retrospective, a lot of people make comments about Barry Goldwater being psychologically insane. Creating the Goldwater rule is when you have not personally diagnosed the patient or the patient is from a long time ago. You cannot make comments about their mental stability. But yeah, to be fair, back then you could, 100 years ago, you could say anything about any president's health, because even if they're young, they could have still died of a lot of things. Now the general rule is, unless you are, already got a long-term condition, you're likely to live out your presidential term. Joe Biden will turn 80. It was a miracle Reagan wasn't killed. He was 70, and the only reason he survived was because he was in such good health, and then he lived to a very good age. So, it's fair to wonder. Trump was very poorly with COVID. He was in hospital. It's a good job he didn't die.
This is not something that's going away. We're going to have to keep talking about it. Hopefully not in hindsight. And thankfully, JFK's assassination, that was, the 60s. Thankfully, we haven't had a president die in office since and or been assassinated, although we've had the close calls. So long may that trend last. But Sarah Stook, we love talking history with you. Always appreciate having you on. Let folks know what you've got coming up, what you're working on now, and where they can follow you until we have you back on again, because you're one of our regulars and we enjoy having you.
I've said it for the past probably 3 episodes I've been on, that I will do one about vice presidents. I promise I will do it, but it takes a lot longer when you don't know as much about vice presidents as you do first ladies, and I do have other things I have to write for the publications. So I promise I will. The first one will be done at some point. It's going to be pretty long. I'm doing it in multiples of 7 because it matches up with a number. I promise. But for the Mallard, I'm just doing one about fascinating European royals who aren't as well known. So there won't be any Catherine the Greats or Henry VIII. I'm going to be doing people you might not have heard of who have done some amazing things. Flexion's Daily. This piece actually got quite a lot of interest, which was fun. So maybe I'll leave the vice president for now and just keep doing a bit of trivia until I can finally do that first article on them.
Yeah, the only European royal that I know of that I wrote of was Ludwig of Bavaria, of course, who built Neuschwanstein and who magically drowned without having any water in his lungs, and his doctor drowned with him by osmosis, also not having any water in his lungs. So that's the only role I remember because I wrote about New Schwanstein. Sarah Stook, thank you so much for the time today. Love having you. We'll do it again real soon.
What if you could have a career where the opportunities are as vast as our nation, where it's not about mission statements, but a shared mission? At U.S. Customs and Border Protection, we go beyond to protect more than borders. From ship to shore, air to ground, cities to local communities, CBP agents and officers are keeping people safe. Join U.S. Customs and Border Protection and go beyond for something far greater than yourself. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
Every day, we rise, challenging ourselves to work for what we believe in. At U.S. Border Patrol, protecting our borders is more than a job, it's a calling. Agents answer the call, working together to keep our country and communities safe. If you're ready for a new mission, join U.S. Border Patrol and go beyond. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.